So thanks again for being here, Matt. And thank you everyone who is still here and has just joined for the debate workshop this morning. So we continue to have some amazing people spending time with us today. Right now we have the director of debate and the debate coach from the University of Wyoming, Matthew Liu, who I think some of you may have interacted with in the past. And he's going to be sharing some debate wisdom with us this morning. Of course, we encourage you, if you have questions, go ahead and just speak up or raise your hand or put your questions in the chat window. He'll be happy to answer those questions. And also, if you haven't yet, you can continue to put your pizza orders in the chat. And with that, we are going to be talking about cross-examination techniques this morning, which I think is super important because we don't often think about cross-ex as being as important, I think, in the debate as it is, because it's not part of our technical speech time, right? We're not necessarily flowing cross-ex, but it's still a really important part of the debate in terms of advancing your arguments for the judge and both kind of setting up your arguments to get them on the flow later in the debate. So I think this is a really important topic that we don't always talk about as much as we should. The his best tips for creating meaningful cross-ex strategies, even when we're kind of debating in the virtual environment, which can make cross-ex a little bit different. So thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you for having me. And I couldn't agree more that cross-ex is both fundamentally important to winning a debate and often given the short shrift. It's not often treated like a constructive or a rebuttal. So the theme of this lecture, or the title of this lecture, is that cross-ex is speech time. Often you might think that the first speech you give in debate, for example, if you're the 2N, is the 2NC. But it's not. The first speech that you will give is the cross-examination of the 1AC. And people often do the same with the next speech that they will give, thinking ahead to a rebuttal and skipping over cross-ex. And that leads to weak mid-debate speeches that cause the judge to underestimate you. For me, cross-ex is one of my favorite moments of the debate because there are a lot of teams that have elite coaching. I know when I was in high school, I went to a public school and had 0 debate coaches. I had a different chaperone every year who had no prior experience with debate, but we would still debate teams that had 7 or 8 private coaches. And cross-ex was an opportunity to catch them off guard because no matter how many blocks their coaches wrote for them, in cross-ex, they had to think on their feet and deal with me, and I was debating them and not their coaches. So cross-ex is an opportunity where you can get someone off their blocks and really show the judge that you are just as smart, if not smarter than your opponents, no matter who you're debating. But to do that, you have to treat it like a speech. You need to know what you're going to say when you stand up. You wouldn't stand up for your 1AC without having a 1AC written. You wouldn't stand up for the 2AC having no idea how you were going to respond to your opponent's arguments. And the exact same thing is true with cross-ex. You should prepare for it like it's a speech. You should have arguments that you're going to make during that cross-ex written down. So I'm going to divide this lecture into 3 parts: an overview of the types of questions you can ask, my big, most important tips for cross-ex, and then my smaller, more finessed tips for cross-examination. And if at any point you all want to interrupt me, please do. You can turn your video on, you can turn your mic, just your mic on and leave your video off. If you type a question into the chat and I don't immediately respond to it, anyone, even someone who didn't write the question, please feel free to turn your mic on and make sure I do see that question in the chat. You can definitely talk to me during this lecture. Okay.
Hey, Matt. Also,
Yes.
before you get started, I just wanted to let you know, some of the students who are here currently, I know, are also big Congress fans. So if at any point, I know cross-ex is a lot different than asking questions in Congress, but if at any point you see any cross-applicability there, that might be good to flag.
Noted. Will do. I think in all events, there's 3 types of cross-ex questions. The first is an information-seeking question. This question is self-descriptive, trying to figure something out about the debate, trying to understand your opponent's arguments. So you ask the question so that you can learn what your opponent has said. And as counterintuitive as it may seem, these questions should be avoided as much as possible. The reason why is that debate is a competition, and your opponent does not have your best interests in mind. They want to win. You want to win. So if you ask a question to try and understand your opponent's position, if they're experienced at debate, if they're clever, they will use that question as an opportunity to persuade the judge that their position is right. To me, cross-ex is all about who can score the most gains with the judge. It is not a conversation with your opponent. It is a conversation with the judge, because you can't change your opponent's mind. Your opponent is hardwired to disagree with you because the ballot's at stake. The one persuadable person in the room is the judge, which means that information-seeking questions, although occasionally but hopefully rarely necessary, don't do anything for you. They have zero productive potential because you won't be persuading the judge of anything. And if your opponent is smart, they will use that question against you. So I often hear questions, especially with younger debaters, like, did you read the Joe 14 evidence? Or what's the last piece of evidence you read? These are information-seeking questions too. They don't advance an argument. And for folks that feel compelled to ask questions like that, I have one piece of advice, and that's flow. I start the timer when you ask the first question, no matter what that question is. If your question is, what perms did you make? Well, you asked a question. The timer for cross-ex have started. If you asked, where'd you mark that last piece of evidence? Well, you asked a question. The timer has started. Now, I may agree, it's not the most useful question, but it is a question, so the timer has started, which is why you can ask those questions, those clarification questions, even during prep time, and you should keep them out of cross-ex, because cross-ex is a time to communicate with the judge. The second type of question is a trap, or the reverse pit of doom. When you ask a question that's a trap, your goal is to motivate the speaker to give the answer you want by misleading them to think it's the answer you don't want. Or just to make it really simple, traps are reverse psychology. Because debaters are hardwired to disagree with their opponents, you can often game out getting the answer you want by manipulating your opponent. If you ask during a real debate your opponent if the sky is blue, I bet that they will hesitate before they answer, because we are so coded to disagree with our opponents that we hear ridiculous answers in debates sometimes. Some very obvious questions, people will respond, oh, well, the 1AC doesn't take a stance on that. Because folks are so afraid to commit to things when you ask a question, they'll engage in some ridiculous hedging because they don't want to give anything up. And you can often take advantage of this instinct to guide people into giving you the answers that you want. So for example, I'm not sure how familiar you are with jargon like link turning or straight turning, but folks often try to steal their opponent's impacts. Someone reads a disadvantage against you, and you think the AF solves the impact to that disadvantage better than the negative does. Well, you can steal that impact and say, hey, the AF solves this. It's our impact now. And you can set that up in cross-ex by trapping them on the impact and saying, oh, well, why is this impact important? Sort of rope-a-dope questions that ask, like, wouldn't it take forever for climate change to happen? Don't other things make this impact inevitable? Isn't this a pretty small impact or an unlikely impact? And if you're planning on stealing that impact, every time your opponent tells the judge, no, it's the most important impact in the round because it's the biggest, the fastest, and the most likely, Well, in a later speech, you can say, we'll concede from cross-ex that my opponent said that this impact was the biggest, the fastest, and the most likely. That means at the end of the round, if we're winning 1% of this impact, even if our opponent is winning 100% of everything else, you should vote on this because we are strategically conceding the argument they made in cross-ex that it's the most important impact. So you can set up that trap. Traps are great, but they're difficult to set and they require a lot of planning. And that means they're not going to dominate your average cross-ex. That brings us to our last type of question, the most important type of question, the argumentative question. Argumentative questions produce direct clash by refuting something your opponent said. I think you're wrong about X. What's your response to that? The what's your response to that is, that's not something you have to actually say. I throw it in there because people often ask me, well, it's not really a question if you're just arguing, is it? And I disagree. I think there's always a question when you point out a flaw with your opponent's argument. And that question is, how would you respond to this attack on your case? Argumentative questions should make up the vast majority of your cross-ex because they have utility. They persuade the judge. They showcase your arguments. They poke holes in your opponent's case. So they should make up the majority of your cross-ex. The next section of this lecture, as promised, is my 5 big tips. And they are all oriented about how to do an argumentative cross-ex right. Big tip number 1, argue, don't ask. Argue, don't ask. Argumentative questions get airtime for your arguments. They put your arguments in the judge's mind and allow them to hang out there, and they save you time in your later speeches. Imagine that you have to communicate an incredibly complex argument to the judge, and it's just one part of the 1-R that you're planning on giving that's going to be a very busy 1-R. And the hard part is getting the judge to understand the argument, not just like say all the words in order, but you have to get it to click in your judge's mind to persuade them. Well, you get a 3-minute head start in the cross-examination of the 2AC. And if you can get the complicated concept out there and explain it, that saves you so much time in your later speech. And that doesn't mean saying the often clunky line, oh, well, that was in cross-ex. It just means implicitly the explanatory work has already been done, so the judge understands your argument, and that is going to save you time. Argue, don't ask. This means avoiding open-ended questions. So, for example, let's say the affirmative has an international law advantage. I think this is something that's pretty common with death penalty affirmatives under the criminal justice topic, is they will say that eliminating the death penalty brings US law into harmonization with international law. So an open-ended question would be, how do you solve for US compliance with international law? When I say that question's open-ended, what I mean is that it doesn't have an argument embedded in it. The affirmative can take that question and say there are 3 ways we solve international law. The first is yada, yada, yada. The second is yada, yada, yada. And if we think about cross-ex as a tally chart, AF on one side, neg on the other, if you ask the question, how do you solve international law? How many arguments did you make? The answer is 0. You made 0 arguments. But when your opponent stands up and says there are 3 ways we solve international law, they're probably about to make 3 arguments. So 1, 2, 3 arguments in their column. Obviously, quality beats quantity, but you got to make arguments to have quality arguments. Instead, if you were to say, I don't think you solve international law because even if the death penalty violates it, so does our drone policies in the Middle East and North Africa, detaining indefinitely without rights people in Guantanamo Bay, and separating families at the border, which are 3 other reasons that international law will continue to be violated by the United States. How do you solve for that? That's 3 arguments in your column. And there's an additional beneficial effect for you. With the first question, the open-ended question, how do you solve international law? The affirmative isn't constrained at all. They're not put in a box. They can say whatever they want, and they can stump speech. That means they can give the most prepared version of their speech. They can read their Solvency 2AC and say, here's the 3 reasons we solve. With the argumentative question, you take away your opponent's ability to give a stump speech, a well-prepared block about why they solve, because you're pigeonholing them. If I give my generic 3 reasons I solve to answer the alt cause question about drones, Guantanamo Bay, and family separation policies, it's not responsive. I'll have dropped all 3 warrants. So you constrain your opponent's answer by avoiding open-ended questions. And the difference is whether or not you've attached and embedded an argument to that question. The single most important thing you can do to improve your cross-ex is argue, don't ask. Second, don't beat a dead horse. After debaters learn to argue, don't ask, the number 1 mistake I see in cross-ex is pacing. Debaters get stuck on a question, usually because their opponent refuses to agree with them. And this is a mistake that forgets the purpose of cross-ex. It's about the judge, not your opponents. You can't convince your opponents of anything, but you can use the cross-ex to communicate with the judge. So the question you should ask yourself about how long you've been spending on a particular argument is, how long does it take the judge to understand the argument that I'm making with this question? And the answer is usually that the judge understands the point of the question before you've finished asking it. We get it right away. It's very quick. So after the judge understands your argument, from a strategic perspective, the rest of the time you spend on that question, unless you're kind of getting to the next level, responding to a response, is not useful to you. It's diminishing marginal utility. Asking the same question not twice has no different effect than asking the same question the first time. It provides no new information to the judge. In fact, it might even hurt you. How many times have we seen this scenario? You ask a question, your opponent flubs it. They just have no good answer. You rocked them. You're clearly winning this question. And then you repeat the question, and your opponent's answer improves a little bit. They've had some time to think about it. You gave them a second chance. We should not be in the business of giving our opponents a second chance. If you win a question in cross-ex, if your opponent stumbles, then you should suavely move on. You should continue to your next question. I've seen some epic stumbles in cross-ex turn into huge saves because the person cross-exing them repeated the question. Now, if your opponent just honestly doesn't hear you, that's a different story. We're not in this business to be mean-spirited. But if your opponent doesn't have a good answer to your question, you don't have to give them a second chance. Pacing is important. And I tell my debaters they should set a goal of asking 8 unique argumentative questions during the cross-ex. That means 8 questions written down before you stand up to give the cross-ex. Now, setting this goal is more important than completing it. I want to repeat that. Setting the goal is more important than completing it. I'm not saying my expectation is that you ask 8 unique argumentative questions during cross-ex, but if you're not ready to ask 8 questions, then you might run out of steam. You might need a Twix moment where you have a lot of uhs and ums, and you're trying to think of your next question, and there's some silence or dead time that doesn't do great work for your speaker points during the debate. And if this seems hard, just think about how many arguments you make in a constructive or a rebuttal. 8 questions is just a little under 3 arguments per minute in cross-ex. And do you really think that you don't make 3 arguments per minute during a constructive or rebuttal? And it's honestly even less than that, since your cross-ex is roughly divided in half, sharing speech time with your opponent so that they can answer questions. I know that everyone in this room can make 1.5 arguments a minute during a rebuttal. So I also know that you can do it during a cross-examination. So pacing is important. We don't want to beat a dead horse. After we make a point, we want to move on to our next point. But there's an exception. If your opponent has a smart, well-developed response to your question, you're in a different situation, because you don't want to take an L on a question that you asked. You don't want to look like you're losing an issue in cross-ex. And so the difference is whether you're making a new argument to respond to their verbal parry, or if you're just repeating your same question over and over again. If you ask a question and your opponent gives a smart answer, you should respond to that answer. But we're going to have a formula for our response, and we're going to call that formula no and. If you've done any improv, if you've seen, a TV show about improv, you're probably familiar with yes and. In improvisational comedy, the idea is that you always say yes to something and then you move it on to a new topic. In cross-examination, it's no and. Or transition to win. You respond to your opponent's argument, but then you quickly move into a new question, because you don't want to get bogged down. You have a bunch of different things that you want to do in this cross-ex. You have an agenda. You have 8 argumentative questions that you want to ask, and you want to get through all of them. So we're not going to let our opponent bog us down, but neither are we going to let a smart argument go unanswered. So the goal is no and. You respond to the argument, and then before they can get a word in edgewise, you move on to your next question. There's an art of control in this, because your answer needs to be short enough that it's not perceived to require a response, so that the judge doesn't feel like you're being too aggressive when you move on to your next question. But it needs to be developed enough that it has a warrant, that it responds to your opponent's argument. So there's a little bit of an art there. It takes a little bit of practice, and that's something I hope that we can maybe get to with a little bit of a drill at the end of this. There's also an art and a balance to the general idea of interruption in cross-ex. And I think that this is something that's even more important to take seriously in virtual debate, because I think it can reduce our inhibitions to interrupt other people that are a little bit more naturally strong in a setting when you're in the same room as them. And so one of the questions I get most frequently about cross-examination is, how do I balance making sure that I'm not letting my opponent talk during the whole cross-ex with also not looking like a jerk by interrupting all the time? And I actually think, even though this question seems hard to answer, the answer is really simple, and that's 50-50, that you get a fair balance in cross-ex, that you should get roughly equal time. And if your opponent's taking more than that and you interrupt them, it's fine. And if you're taking more than that and your opponent interrupts you, it's probably a good time to sort of hand over the cross-ex. A lot of people get misled when I say like more questions are good, like ask lots of questions, to believe that they should constantly talk over their opponent. And you shouldn't do that. The message it sends when you constantly talk over your opponent is that your arguments can't hold up to the scrutiny of an actual response. And as a judge, if you're not willing to subject your arguments to rigorous interrogation in cross-ex, then I don't trust your arguments. If you don't trust your arguments enough to let your opponents talk about them, I don't trust them either. So there is actually a balance. You give your opponent one real chance to answer your question, the real amount of time that's necessary. You don't owe them a second chance. If they flub the question, you can move on, but you owe them one real chance to answer your question. Third, my third big tip for cross-ex: have a written list of questions. This goes back to our original theme. Cross-ex is a speech. You wouldn't stand up for a constructive or a rebuttal without having something written down. So you shouldn't stand up for a cross-examination without having something written down. It's not enough to have a document or a pile of paper that you want to ask questions about. I guarantee you that leads to a lot of ums and uhs and long transition moments. You should have a written list of questions, because before you give a cross-ex, you've only got 2 jobs. Always. It doesn't matter what cross-ex. There's only 2 jobs you have if a cross-ex is your next speech. Flow and get ready for cross-ex. Flow. Write down your opponent's arguments. 2, get ready for cross-ex. Write down your questions. Those are the only 2 things you have to do. And if you remember that, it makes preparing for cross-ex a lot easier, because that gives you time to do things like read the unhighlighted portions of their evidence. Like, people like to love to shrink this stuff down to like size font 2 if you're debating paperlessly, or you can just highlight that, correct it, make it size 10, read through it, and figure out what are they hiding there? What's so suspicious that it needs to be size 2? And you'll often find a lot of really good arguments against their position buried in their own evidence. Like when a piece of solvency evidence seems really good, but the article title is "The 9 Things We Need to Do to Fix the Criminal Justice System," and they only do 1 of them, and you've found the other 8, that can be a pretty good cross-ex moment. If you remember that you've only got 2 jobs, flow and get ready for cross-ex, then you'll find you have the time to dig into your opponent's evidence like that. You should have a sheet of paper for these cross-ex questions. I don't encourage typing your questions. I really encourage writing down your questions on a separate sheet of paper that is just for cross-ex. 4, prioritize. Prioritize. You shouldn't just ask your cross-ex questions in the order that you thought of them. You should have a mission, a plan, priorities. And you should be ready to radically reorganize the order of your questions as you think of better ones and questions that better get at the heart of the debate. So for me, that looked like, taking my pen and scratching out the number 1, right? Like I thought halfway through my opponent's speech, I thought I had this killer question that was going to be my opening question. But then maybe you realize, even though the question's really good, it's not about something that's going to matter at the end of the debate. And you want to make your questions count and have staying power. You want to ask questions about priority issues. So it means scratching out that number 1, making that question number 3, 4, and writing number 1 next to a different question, so that those numbers are a roadmap for your cross-ex. I'm going to ask this question first, then this one, then this one. And while you're writing new questions, you're also changing the order of those questions, the organizational scheme of your cross-ex, because you're figuring out what's going to matter most in the debate. Almost everything in a debate falls away. Think about how many arguments are made in the block, that 8-minute constructive plus 5-minute rebuttal. Obviously, just, through the way time works, not all of those arguments are going to be in the 2AR or the 2NR, because those are only 5-minute speeches. If your opponent stands up and reads 7 off-case arguments against you, 6 of those are probably not going to be in the 2NR. They're not going to be in the final negative rebuttal. So part of what we want to do in cross-examination is make sure that the things we're asking questions about will still matter at the end of the debate. Cross-ex is a moment where you can really connect with the judge and score some big points. But points only matter if they help you win. And if the arguments you make are about arguments that are so bad that the negative's clearly not going to extend them, then those questions don't have staying power. They don't last till the end of the debate. And that means that you should avoid easy wins. It can be tempting to cross-ex on something you know is a bad argument, but what's the point? You're going to beat that in your constructive or your rebuttal anyway. You should cross-ex on hard, complicated issues, the most important issues, the places where you're behind, so you can mount a comeback. because that makes cross-ex useful to you. Beating easy, bad arguments in cross-ex feels good, but doesn't matter as much about at the end of the debate. Part of this, prioritizing and making your questions matter, means don't re-cross-ex the case. When you are negative, you get a shot to cross-ex the 1AC, and that's the cross-ex of the 1AC. So often, I see people return to asking questions about the case. Usually the negative, but sometimes even the affirmative will go after the negative indites of their case. No one should be cross-exing the 1AC after the 1AC, because there's new, often more important things happening that you have to keep up on in the debate. Now, I want to talk about each speech for a little bit, and I want to talk about what I think are the most important things to cross-ex during those speeches. So we'll start with the 1AC. When we're cross-exing the 1AC, my suggestion is you stay focused on solvency and internal links. Then this goes against a lot of cross-ex advice that other folks give. A lot of folks sometimes say cross-ex the terminal impacts. Does economic decline lead to great power war? Because those things are often outlandish, and it is easy to cross-ex outlandish things. And that's my point too. It's easy to cross-ex outlandish things. Spend your time on the parts that are a little bit more complicated because they're often more important: solvency and internal links. Think about that question I asked about international law with all those alt causes, all those different reasons the US violates international law. It is often even more absurd for the affirmative to say they solve the entirety of some big impact: economic growth, international law, the elimination of all racism and structural violence, than it is to say that those things are important, because obviously, the economy matters, obviously racism matters, obviously international law matters. But the question is, can you really do something about that? Because most affirmatives aren't upending whole systems. They're one-shot deals. They're silver bullets. They're tweaks to the system. The plain text is like 8 words long. It's like 20 words long. You really think you're going to durably solve economic growth for all time with that 20-word tweak to the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of US code? To me, that's even sillier than the claims about the terminal impacts. So cross-ex of the 1AC, solvency, and internal links. Cross-ex of the 1NC should focus on the off-case positions you believe are most likely to be in the 2NR, right? Because you want to cross-ex things that are going to matter at the end of the debate. And there are a couple of ways that you can sort of figure out what's going to matter most at the end of the debate. The first is by scouting and knowing your opponent and their tendencies. Are you debating a team that reads a diverse 1NC, but always goes for the critique? Well, I'd spend at least 2 minutes cross-exing the critique. Honestly, I'd bet big. I'd cross-ex the critique for all 3 minutes, because if you know your opponent wants to go for it, then either you're going to do some damage that will matter at the end of the debate, or you're going to divert them from the path that they want to go. So you can, combine your scouting efforts and your knowledge about your opponents so that you can program, so that you can create a cross-ex that is tailored to respond to what your opponent likes to do. But there are often other signals as well. Let's say you don't have any scouting information. You've just got these, 3 disadvantages that your opponent has read about why your affirmative is a bad idea. So ask the question, which one's the most threatening? Which disadvantage actually links to the affirmative? And spend your time on that position. Because if it's the best position in the 1NC, then it's the one your opponent is most likely to go for. So we use a threat factor. You cross-ex what looks scariest because it's the thing that's the most likely for your opponent to continue talking about during the debate. And I can understand the natural proclivity about why this doesn't happen a lot of times with younger debaters, because why would you cross-ex the thing that you don't understand wouldn't that lead to a losing cross-ex? And the answer is twofold. If you prepare and focus on that position, it doesn't have to be a losing cross-ex. If you remember you've only got two jobs, flow and write questions, then you might find you end up coming up with some good arguments to respond to that position in cross-ex. Arguments your partner can incorporate into their speech so that you're generating arguments for your next constructive or rebuttal at the same time as you're cross-exing about it. The second response to the query, why would I cross-ex something that I'm afraid of, that I don't understand, is that you're going to have to deal with it at some point. It's coming. It's right around the corner. So get the conversation started, because you can start to work through and develop your answers in the cross-examination. It's a head start. If you don't take it, you still have to debate the position, just a little bit less prepared later on. Cross-ex of the 2AC. Cross-ex of the 2AC should be about what you want to go for in the 2NR. Now, let me talk about block strategy for a second, because to understand how to cross-ex the 2AC, you need to understand block strategy. In the negative block, that 8-minute 2NC and that 5-minute 1NR, that should always be a divided speech. You're splitting up the issues. Maybe the 2N takes a disadvantage, or let's say a counter plan in case, and the 1N just takes one disadvantage. You've split the block. That's good, because you're not going to repeat yourselves. Now, here's the thing. The 1NR should take the most important position in the debate. And every 2N in the room just recoiled. They're like, give my partner the most important thing in the debate? No, that's mine. That's not a good instinct for 2Ns to have, although it is one that many younger 2Ns do seem to have. Got to trust your partner. The 1NR has an incredible amount of structural advantages over the 2NC. The 1NR gets, on average, 14 minutes of prep time. The entirety of the 2NC, the cross-ex of the 2NC, and all the prep that the 2N takes. If the 2N takes 3 minutes of prep, that's 3 minutes of prep that the 1N just got to take too, plus an 8-minute constructive, plus a 3-minute rebuttal. The 1NR also isn't cross-exed. Your opponents get to interrogate the 2NC for 3 minutes, but they don't get to touch the 1NR. They don't get to cross-examine the 1NR. So there's all these ways that add up that end up making 1NR seconds worth more than 2NC seconds. Just purely in terms of prep time, you've got more time to prepare. So the goods, your best argument, you should put it in the 1NR. How does this relate to cross-ex? My rule of thumb for the cross-ex of the 2AC, is that it should add 3 minutes to the 1NR. 2NC is an 8-minute speech, 1NR is a 5-minute speech. But if all of the cross-ex of the 2AC is spent dismantling the 2AC to what you're going to take in the 1NR, you are adding 3 minutes to the 1NR. And suddenly the block is 2 8-minute speeches. A laser-like focus on the singular argument, the singular off-case argument that you want to put in the 1NR adds 3 minutes to the 1NR. And that's a fantastically useful thing to do. Because then when you take that position in the 1NR, on every complicated, nuanced argument that would normally take a bunch of time to explain, you've already convinced the judge you're right on those questions in cross-ex. So while you still have to make the arguments, you don't have to take the time to explain them as in-depth to get that original click from the judge, because the judge has already clicked during cross-ex. The one thing you should never do in the cross-ex to the 2AC is cross-ex on an off-case position you're not planning on extending in the block. Let's say their answers to topicality are just atrocious, but neither the 2NC nor the 1NR is going to take topicality. No matter how many points you score on topicality, it's worthless because you're not extending those arguments. But if their answers are atrocious, why aren't you extending those arguments? It's a weird circle there, but we're going to move on. Cross-ex of the 2NC follows this same formula. You focus on what you think is going to matter at the end of the debate with a particular attention to offense. If the 2NC takes a disadvantage, a counter plan. You want to spend your time on those things, not the case debate. And smart 2Ns obstruct this goal by putting those most important things in the 1NR. But smart 2Ns are not every 2N that you'll encounter. And an unfortunate amount of second negative speakers have narcissistic tendencies and refuse to give the 1NR the most important argument. And this is something you can take advantage of. Because when the 2N puts the argument they want to go for into the 2NC, you get an extra 3 minutes to attack it. So don't hesitate and spend all 3 minutes on that argument. 2Ns, particularly narcissistic 2Ns, are often easy to read because you can go after the argument that they care about the most, because they'll be sending very clear signals that they care about that argument so much. Okay.
What kinds of symbols?
So it can be as small as when they're excited about something, and sometimes that comes out in interrupting their partner. So let's jump back to the cross-examination of the 1NC. If the 1N is being grilled on the critique, and suddenly the 2N starts to take over this cross-ex, they interrupt their partner, and they're like, well, actually, this is how the alternative functions. Okay, that's a signal, right? They felt so strongly about this that they had to interrupt their partner, which is like rude and not good for speaker points, and talk about that issue. Or even in a sort of less rude way, a lot of 1Ns will often defer on issues like this. So if the 1N knows their partner wants to talk about the critique, when a question about the critique comes up, they'll just sort of awkwardly do this and look at their partner, and then their partner just takes over. Well, that's a big signal if the 2N is starting to talk during the cross-ex to the 1NC. Another signal is just the sort of passion displayed. If when the 2N is talking about turn on case and they're just sort of on autopilot, they're very monotone, they're just going through the motions. And there's a comparative moment when they're extremely excited about something, when they stop the monotone, when they're interacting more with the judge. Those are examples of signals that that's what your opponent wants to focus on. It's probably going to be the thing that they focus on at the end of the debate. That's a great question. Thank you, Jasmine. And my fifth point is actually kind of on the same subject too, actually, because my fifth point is that cross-ex is a crystal ball to predict your opponent's plans. I'm going to admit this up front. I thought I was pretty good at cross-ex when I debated. I didn't get this one until I started judging. Cross-ex is a crystal ball to predict your opponent's plans. If your opponents do cross-ex well, if they do everything that I've just told you to do, then they will be cross-exing the most important arguments, the arguments that they care the most about. Well, that's a message to you. That's a message about what they're going to be going for at the end of the debate. So you should take advantage of that and start prepping answers right away. I didn't do this when I debated, but it's now how I coach my debaters to debate. When somebody makes an argument that you don't have a good answer to in cross-ex, you should start writing a block to it right away, because it's going to come around again. And if you wait to hear the argument again in a rebuttal or a later constructive, you'll have wasted an opportunity to get some sort of free prep time, to get a head start on that question. If you get trounced in cross-ex on a question, my instinct was like, I'll fix it later, right? It's going to come up again in a speech, and then on my flow, after the argument is made in a speech, I'll start writing out my answers. That's a bad instinct, because it's procrastination. And worse, it's procrastination on something you just took an L on. If you didn't have a very good response in cross-ex, kicking the can down the road is not the most intelligent move. You should start dealing with the fact that you didn't have a great answer to a question right away, starting to get an edge on that question, starting to develop answers, talk about the argument with your partner so you can work on dedicating time and energy to think about how you'll fix that. Now, cross-ex is a crystal ball to predict what your opponent wants to do. It's still the right thing to cross-ex the most important arguments. This is a tip on how to take advantage of a good cross-ex, because a good cross-ex is focused on things that matter. And the downside of that is that you're telling your opponent what matters. But it's still the right thing to do. It's still the best, the optimal cross-ex strategy, because again, your opponent is a bit player in the debate. The most important person is the judge, and you definitely want to communicate the arguments that matter to your judge. Okay, I've got one section of this lecture left, and that is my sort of smaller, my 9 finessed tips for cross-ex. These are each going to be sort of much quicker. So if you need me to repeat something, definitely let me know. First, small tip. Don't do the Control F test. Questions like, where does this evidence say X? Can you read a line from your evidence that says Y? You lose time asking these questions because it's quicker just to make this argument in a constructive and a rebuttal where your opponent can't obfuscate the response. If you ask me where a piece of evidence says something, I'm not pulling up a document. I'm not grabbing a piece of paper with the card on it. I'm just going to start making arguments. Your opponent might lie. They might say, oh, the line's right here. Is it there? Is it not? Who knows? The judge doesn't because they're listening to you, not looking at a document. They might bend the truth, or worst of all, they might make an argument that's better than the evidence. If you ask the question, where does your card say this? And your opponent just gives an answer, if they just explain something very well, you're left with saying, but your evidence doesn't say that. And here's a tip. Judges like smart analytical arguments better than they like bad pieces of evidence. So when you've given the opponent an opportunity to just make a smart argument, the judge isn't going to check out on you don't have a card that says that. Somebody made a smart argument, and that's the thing I'm going to listen to. So avoid the Control F test. A focus on minutia in evidence is less useful than a focus on big picture arguments. 2, communicate with your partner. Integrate their arguments. The cross-ex to the 1AC is a great example of this. A good cross-ex to the 1AC should rip apart the affirmative case. It should be boom, 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 boom. I'm just making a bunch of arguments about why your AF is not good. Not saying that, that's mean, right? It's mean to say your AF is not good. It's useful to ask questions that demonstrate the AF is not good. The 1N needs to integrate these. Every good question from cross-ex about the 1AC should become an analytical argument on the case flow during the 1NC. The cross-ex of the 2NC is one of my favorite cross-exes as a 1A. As a 1A, the 1AR is a hard speech, right? You've got a 13-minute negative block to respond to, and that's tough to do in 5 minutes. One of the things that makes it easier is the cross-ex of the 2NC. During the cross-ex of the 2AC, the captain of the aft ship, the 2A, is poking holes in negative arguments. And I consider the cross-ex of the 2NC to be a love letter to the 1AR. It's a fireside chat with the 1AR. During the cross-ex of the 2NC, the 2A is talking to the judge, right? Because, we don't care about our opponents. We're communicating with the judge. But they're really also talking to the 1A, because every time my partner stood up and said, there's a problem with this counterplan, judge, he was also saying, hey, Matt, make this argument against the counterplan. It's a really good solvency deficit. So if you pay attention to your partner's cross-exes, they're telling you what to do. And the cross-ex of the 2NC is a bat signal for directing what the 1AR should be talking about. It's the 2A explicitly saying to the 1AR, this is the most important issue in the debate. This is what you should focus on. So you should definitely be prepping the 1AR during the cross-ex of the 2NC, but you should have one ear open to listen to your partner. Third, don't interrupt your partner. Often get the question, is tag team cross-ex allowed? I don't remember the last time I heard someone say no to that question, but just because something's allowed doesn't mean it's a good idea. When you interrupt your partner during cross-ex, you destroy their rhythm and their credibility. You send a signal that you lack confidence in your partner, and that undermines your ethos as a team. It's also gross. No judge likes the partner that creepily interrupts their partner and communicates that they think their partner can't handle their own speeches. And it's sadly far more common for a dude to interrupt someone who's not a dude, and there's most definitely a sexist element to how frequently we see that happen. So whether there's a gendered element or not, you should definitely focus on the thing that you are supposed to be doing. If the cross-ex isn't your speech, you've got another job. Maybe it's prepping the 2AC or the 2NC. But if you're interrupting your partner's cross-ex, you're not doing your job. I understand the urge to intervene. In high school, I was that person. I was more invested in debate than my partner. So I thought, I guess, somewhere in my subconscious that their arguments were not as good as the arguments I could be making. And it wasn't until my junior year when a judge sat me down and was like, never do this again, ever, that I really figured out why it was not helping us win. And I call this the hot seat effect theory. If you're not in the hot seat, you might think that you can give even a marginally better answer to your question. And the thing is, the unfortunate, truthful thing is, it's often true. If you're not under pressure, like the person who's actually being cross-examined, you might have a marginally better answer. But a marginally better answer doesn't make up for all the ethos and credibility damage that you do by interrupting your partner. So I've got 3 rules for interventions in cross-ex. Rule number 1 is you don't intervene unless you're going to lose because of something your partner has said or not said. Rule number 2 is plan your intervention so it's the most efficient as possible. And rule number 3 is never intervene in the bottom 30 seconds of a speech. It's absolutely never worth it. 4, verbal slip-ups are not concessions. Verbal slip-ups are not concessions. At least once a tournament, I watch a debate where a debater believes that a misunderstanding from cross-ex is a vital concession, and judges don't see that the same way. If somebody didn't actually hear your question correctly, and so they give a slightly wrong answer, they haven't made the concession that you think they have. So listen carefully to your opponent to make sure that when you are getting a W in cross-ex, you're actually getting it, and it's not just a verbal slip-up. 5, there are a couple of phrases you should avoid. The first is, if you make that argument, we'll answer it. I just judged a debate where this happened at the Wyoming round robin. If you make that argument, we'll answer it. This is my least favorite phrase in cross-ex because it's happening. It's literally happening. They literally just made that argument. How can you say if you make that argument, we'll answer it? They just did. It's happening. This is just a barely clever way of saying, I don't know. I don't know how to respond to that, so I'm delaying. This is the delay counterplan. I will try to fix my answer to this later. And I would rather hear an honest response that you don't know the answer to the question than I would that line, because it's not true. But really, I think that the ability to say that line just causes people to think that they don't have to work to try and answer a question. So eliminate from your vocabulary, if you make that argument, we'll answer it. 6, don't cross-ex after the timer goes off. Speech times are non-negotiable. Constructives are 8 minutes, rebuttals are 5 minutes, cross-examination is 3 minutes. If the timer goes off, it's over. You don't get bonus time for constructives, you don't get bonus time for rebuttals, and you don't get bonus time for cross-ex. Once the timer has gone off, your speech is over. 7th, don't draw attention to dropped arguments. This seems like it's intuitively a place you want to cross-ex. Hey, you dropped this disadvantage. You're going to lose, right? Okay, I get it, right? You know, you're excited. They dropped an argument, but there's no way you can win from that question. If it's true that your opponent dropped an argument, then you already have a perfect score here. You can't do better. They have 0 answers, but you're giving them a second chance. You're giving them the opportunity to make new answers. 8th and last, reject the premise of the question. When you are being cross-examined, people will ask loaded questions. They will say, given XYZ, what do you do about this? These questions can be tough to answer when your opponent spends time front-loading argumentation into their question. So my response to that is reject the premise of the question. And use that phrase. I disagree with the premise of your question. Smart opponents try to put you in a box by front-loading arguments into their question. In fact, I explicitly told you to do that. So my advice to you, reject the premise of the question. Okay, I think that's actually my time. I'm happy to answer questions or happy to let you all go on a break. I hope that some of that was helpful. I will say before I go, the University of Wyoming attempts to provide a lot of completely free assistance to high school debaters, primarily through our program Team Wyoming. If you have any interest in that, if you liked this lecture, if you'd like to continue to talk to myself about debate or talk to other University of Wyoming coaches about debate, that's something we try to do completely for free. Only catch is we require parental permission, but that's something that any of the DUDL staff can help you with if you're interested in getting involved. All right, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I just have to say, well, first of all, that was one of the best debate lectures I've ever heard in my life. So thank you so much. There were so many really useful, practical things that you all can implement. And I'm really so happy that Matt emphasized never saying in cross X, we'll make that, we'll respond to that argument when you make it. That's one of my all-time least favorite things to hear in a debate. So